On the night of April 19th, 1989, New York City was already on edge. Crime rates were high, public trust in institutions was fragile, and tension between communities and police had been building for years. Central Park, often portrayed as a calm refuge during the day, transformed after sunset into a place many avoided. That night, it became the center of one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history. Shortly after 9 p.m., police began receiving scattered reports from inside the park. Groups of teenagers were seen running along the paths. Some witnesses described shouting. Others said people were being harassed or chased. None of the early calls mentioned a serious assault. What officers had was noise, confusion, and fragments of information that did not yet form a crime. As patrol units moved into the park, they encountered dozens of youths. Some were questioned briefly and released. Others were detained based on little more than their presence in the area. The atmosphere was chaotic. Officers were responding to multiple incidents at once, with no clear understanding of what had actually occurred. Several hours later, just before 1 a.m., emergency responders found a woman lying unconscious near the northern section of the park. She had suffered severe injuries. She was barely alive. There were no witnesses nearby. No one had reported seeing an attack in that location. The scene offered few immediate answers. The woman was rushed to the hospital. Doctors worked to stabilize her condition. Investigators secured the area, but physical evidence was limited. There was no weapon recovered, no fingerprints, no clear trail leading away from the scene. At that moment, the identity of the attacker was completely unknown. News of the assault spread quickly through police channels and then through the media. By morning, headlines described a brutal crime in the heart of New York City. Public outrage followed almost immediately. City officials demanded swift action. The pressure on law enforcement intensified with every hour that passed without an arrest. Behind closed doors, investigators faced a problem. They had a violent crime, a public demanding justice, and no clear suspect. In situations like this, time becomes an enemy. The longer a case remains unsolved, the more confidence erodes, and the greater the temptation to accept answers that appear to fit, even if they are incomplete. Earlier that night, several teenage boys had been detained in connection with the disturbances reported in the park. They were young, between 14 and 16 years old. None had been caught committing a violent assault. None had been identified by the victim. But their presence in the park placed them within reach of an investigation that was rapidly changing direction. One by one, the boys were brought into police stations across the city. They were separated from one another. Parents were not always present. Lawyers were not immediately requested or provided. What began as questioning soon turned into hours of interrogation. Fatigue set in. Confusion grew. The boys were asked to explain events they barely understood themselves. Some tried to piece together timelines from memory. Others repeated rumors they had heard. Their accounts did not match. Details shifted. Times were inconsistent. Locations changed. Instead of raising concern among investigators, these contradictions were interpreted differently. The inconsistencies were seen as signs of deception, rather than the natural result of frightened teenagers attempting to answer questions after hours without sleep. As the night turned into morning, the narrative began to solidify. Investigators believed they were close to resolving the case. Statements were written, rewritten, adjusted. Each revision moved closer to a version of events that seemed to explain the crime, even though no physical evidence supported it. What was missing from the developing story was also the most important element. There was still no direct link between any of the boys and the assault itself. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitness identification. Yet the momentum of the investigation continued to build. By the end of that first day, the direction of the case was no longer uncertain. 5 teenagers had become suspects in a crime that would soon define their lives. The city had its answer, and few were willing to ask whether it was the right one. What followed would reveal how quickly an investigation can move from uncertainty to certainty, even when the foundation beneath it is dangerously thin. As the interrogations continued, a pattern began to form. Investigators returned to the same questions repeatedly, adjusting the wording each time. When an answer did not align with the developing theory, it was challenged. When a detail seemed useful, It was reinforced. Over hours of questioning, the line between memory and suggestion slowly began to blur. Some of the boys were told that others had already confessed. Others were warned that remaining silent would only make their situation worse. In several cases, they were led to believe that admitting involvement would allow them to go home. For teenagers with little understanding of the legal system, these promises carried weight. Statements were recorded after midnight. Some were revised the following morning. In a few cases, details appeared in later versions that had not been mentioned before. The timeline of events shifted. Roles within the alleged crime changed. Despite these inconsistencies, the statements were treated as confirmation rather than cause for doubt. What was striking was not just what the confessions claimed, but what they lacked. The descriptions did not match the physical evidence. They contradicted medical findings. They placed individuals in locations they could not all have occupied at the same time. These contradictions were documented, but not addressed. By the afternoon, prosecutors were briefed on the case. The narrative presented to them was simplified. Complex timelines were reduced. Conflicting statements were framed as minor discrepancies. The absence of physical evidence was downplayed. What mattered was that confessions existed. The media response was immediate. Headlines focused on the arrests. Terms like gang and attack dominated coverage. Public opinion shifted rapidly. The presumption of innocence faded as the story took hold. In the eyes of many, the case was already solved. Inside the investigation, doubts were quietly set aside. Once a case gains momentum, reversing course becomes difficult. Each decision builds on the last. To question the foundation would mean questioning everything that followed. And few institutions are willing to do that under public pressure. The victim remained unable to identify her attacker. Medical experts could not link any suspect to the crime scene. Yet these facts struggled to compete with the power of a compelling narrative. The idea that the case had been resolved was easier to accept than the uncertainty of not knowing. As days passed, the 5 teenagers were formally charged. Their names became public. Their faces appeared on television screens across the country. They were no longer just suspects. They were symbols of a crime that had shaken the city. Behind the headlines, the legal process moved forward. Defense attorneys would later argue that the confessions were unreliable, that they were the result of exhaustion, fear, and coercion. But at this stage, those arguments carried little weight. The foundation of the case had already been laid. A story had been constructed, repeated, and accepted. And once a story is believed, facts that challenge it often struggle to survive. What began as a night of confusion in Central Park had now become something far more permanent. A case built on assumptions, on pressure, on the need for closure rather than certainty. The consequences of that night would unfold slowly, over years rather than days. And while the arrests brought a sense of resolution to the city, they marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for 5 young lives. The real test of the case had not yet begun. That would come later. In court, when the case reached the interrogation rooms, the investigation quietly shifted direction. What mattered most was no longer what had happened in the park, but what could be written down, recorded, and presented as certainty. Confessions became the center of gravity. Everything else revolved around them. Each of the 5 teenagers was questioned separately. The rooms were small, the hours were long, food was limited, sleep was nearly non-existent. Some interrogations lasted more than 10 hours. For boys who had never been inside a police station before, the experience was overwhelming. Investigators began by asking open questions. Where were you that night? Who were you with? What did you see? When answers were vague or uncertain, the questions became more specific. When answers did not fit expectations, they were challenged. Slowly, the scope of acceptable responses narrowed. Several boys were told that others had already implicated them. This was not always true. But the suggestion alone was powerful. The idea that everyone else had already spoken created pressure to comply. Silence began to feel dangerous. At different points, officers introduced details of the crime into the questioning. Locations, actions, sequences. These details did not come from the boys. They came from the investigators. Over time, some of those details began to reappear in later statements. now spoken as if they were memories. One boy described being present but not involved. Another admitted to chasing people but denied assault. A third said he had only watched. None of the accounts matched each other. None matched the physical evidence. But instead of treating this as a warning sign, investigators worked to align the stories. When contradictions appeared, they were reframed. When a timeline failed to make sense, it was adjusted. Statements were rewritten. In some cases, boys were asked to repeat their accounts on video after hours of questioning, using language that was not their own. Parents were often not present. Legal counsel was delayed or absent. Several boys later said they did not understand that they could refuse to answer questions. Others believed they were cooperating in order to go home. None understood the consequences of what they were saying. By the time recordings were made, exhaustion was visible. Voices were flat. Details were confused. Some boys struggled to remember what they had said earlier, but the presence of a recorded confession carried weight that overshadowed everything else. Medical evidence was available by this point. It contradicted key elements of the confessions. The number of attackers described did not match the injuries. The timeline did not align with known facts. Yet these discrepancies were not emphasized. The confessions were treated as truth, and the evidence was expected to conform. Once the statements existed, the case entered a new phase. Investigators stopped asking whether the boys were involved. They began asking how the crime had unfolded. The assumption of guilt was no longer questioned. It was built upon. What was striking was how quickly uncertainty disappeared from official language. Reports shifted from alleged to admitted. Possibilities became conclusions. The narrative hardened, even as its foundation remained unstable. Within days, prosecutors prepared to present the case. They understood the risks. They knew the evidence was thin. But confessions, even flawed ones, were powerful. Jurors believed them. The public believed them. And once spoken, they were difficult to undo. Behind the scenes, some investigators expressed concern. The stories did not line up. The science did not support the claims. But raising doubts at this stage would mean challenging decisions already made. It would mean admitting mistakes. And the system is rarely built to do that easily. As the case moved forward, the confessions became the lens through which everything else was viewed. Facts that supported them were highlighted. Facts that contradicted them faded into the background. For the 5 teenagers, this was the moment everything changed. What they had said in rooms they barely remembered would now follow them into courtrooms they had never imagined entering. And the question that remained unasked was simple. What if the confessions were wrong? When the videotaped statements were finally recorded, they were presented as clear admissions of guilt. What viewers would not see were the hours that came before, the repeated questioning, the corrections, the moments when answers were rejected and replaced with suggestions. The recordings captured conclusions, not the process that led to them. In several tapes, the boys struggled to describe events in sequence. They hesitated. They corrected themselves. At times, they looked off-camera for guidance. Investigators stepped in to clarify, redirecting the narrative when it drifted away from what was expected. These interventions were subtle but consistent. Prosecutors later argued that inconsistencies between the confessions were minor. That memory under stress is imperfect, that the core story remained intact. But the core story itself had never existed as a single, coherent account. It had been assembled piece by piece across different rooms, at different times, from different people. By this stage, forensic results were available. They did not place any of the boys at the scene of the assault. DNA evidence excluded them. Medical experts noted discrepancies between the injuries and the actions described in the statements. These findings were documented, but they did not change the direction of the case. Instead, investigators adjusted their theory. The lack of physical evidence was reframed as the result of multiple attackers. Conflicting timelines were explained away as confusion. The confessions, though inconsistent, were treated as mutually reinforcing. The decision to proceed was not made by a single person. It was the result of a system moving forward one step at a time. Each choice relied on the previous one. To stop would require acknowledging that the foundation was flawed. And by then, the case had already become public. Media coverage intensified. The story was simplified for headlines. Complex legal questions were reduced to certainty. The boys were portrayed as part of a violent group. Their ages were mentioned less frequently. Their faces were shown repeatedly. Public opinion hardened. Inside the legal system, preparations for trial continued. Defense attorneys requested access to all interrogation materials. They raised concerns about the length of questioning and the absence of counsel. They argued that the statements were unreliable. But these arguments faced an uphill battle against the weight of recorded confessions. Judges reviewed the evidence. Some expressed reservations, others deferred to the process. The legal threshold for proceeding to trial was met, even if the standard for truth remained unresolved. What mattered most was that the case appeared complete. There were suspects, there were statements, there was a narrative that explained what had happened. The absence of certainty was overshadowed by the appearance of resolution. For the 5 teenagers, the reality of their situation began to set in. What they had believed were temporary conversations had become permanent records. Words spoken in exhaustion now carried legal consequences they could not undo. The confessions followed them into court filings, press briefings, and public discourse. They were repeated so often that they became accepted as fact. And once accepted, they shaped every decision that followed. As the trial approached, the possibility that the confessions were false became increasingly difficult to confront. Not because the evidence was strong, but because admitting error would mean unraveling everything built upon it. The system had made its choice. The next phase would determine whether anyone was willing to question it. When the trial began, the courtroom was already filled with expectations. For much of the public, the question was no longer whether a crime had occurred, but how severe the punishment should be. The arrests, the confessions, and the headlines had done their work long before the first witness was called. Prosecutors opened the case by presenting a clear narrative. 5 teenagers, a violent attack, a coordinated group action. They spoke with confidence, emphasizing the recorded confessions as the backbone of their argument. To the jury, the story sounded complete. What was missing was not immediately obvious. Defense attorneys took a different approach. They focused on the inconsistencies, the contradictions between statements, the lack of physical evidence. They questioned how 5 people could describe the same event in fundamentally different ways. But in a courtroom, complexity often struggles against simplicity. The confessions were played for the jury. Video recordings showed the boys speaking in calm voices, describing actions they would later say they did not commit. What the jury did not see were the hours of interrogation that preceded those recordings. They did not hear the questions that had shaped the answers. Medical experts testified next. They explained the nature of the victim's injuries. Their findings did not support key elements of the prosecution's timeline. The number of attackers described in the confessions did not match the medical evidence. These discrepancies were acknowledged, but they were not emphasized. DNA evidence was addressed briefly. Tests conducted at the time excluded the defendants. This fact should have carried significant weight. Instead, it was explained away. Prosecutors argued that the absence of DNA did not prove innocence. The jury was asked to focus on the confessions instead. Witness testimony added further complexity. Some witnesses placed individuals in different parts of the park at overlapping times. Others could not confidently identify anyone at all. The accounts did not form a single, consistent picture. But consistency was not the standard being applied. Throughout the proceedings, the teenagers sat quietly beside their attorneys. They were dressed formally. They appeared smaller than their ages suggested. Their families watched from the gallery, listening as a version of events was presented that bore little resemblance to what they remembered. As the trial progressed, the pressure on the jury increased. The case had become symbolic. It was no longer just about evidence. It was about public fear, media attention, and the expectation that justice would be delivered swiftly and decisively. In closing arguments, prosecutors returned to the confessions once more. They urged the jury to trust what had been said on tape, to believe that people do not confess to crimes they did not commit. The idea was simple, and it was persuasive. Defense attorneys responded by warning against that assumption. They explained how false confessions occur. They described the effects of prolonged interrogation, fear, and youth. They asked the jury to consider why no physical evidence connected their clients to the crime. The jury was sent to deliberate. The jury deliberated longer than many had expected. Inside the room, questions emerged almost immediately. Jurors compared notes. They revisited the confessions. They discussed the inconsistencies. Some were troubled by the lack of physical evidence. Others focused on the certainty with which the statements had been delivered on tape. Requests were sent back to the courtroom. Portions of testimony were replayed. Excerpts from the confessions were reviewed again. Each repetition gave the statements more weight, even as doubts remained unresolved. Outside the courtroom, the public waited. Media coverage framed the deliberations as a formality. Few questioned whether the case itself was strong enough to support a conviction. The assumption that the system would work as intended remained largely unchallenged. When the jury returned, the atmosphere was tense. The verdict was read slowly. Guilty. For the teenagers, the moment was disorienting. Some did not immediately understand what had happened. Others looked to their attorneys, searching for reassurance that did not come. Family members reacted with shock and disbelief. The weight of the decision settled in silence. Sentencing followed. The boys were given years in prison. Their youth was acknowledged, but it did not change the outcome. The court accepted the confessions as reliable. The absence of physical evidence was not enough to overcome them. In the days that followed, reactions were divided. Some praised the verdict as justice served. Others expressed concern about the process. Civil rights organizations raised questions about the interrogations. Legal experts debated whether the case had been handled properly. Appeals were filed. Arguments were made about coerced confessions and evidentiary gaps. But appeals move slowly, and the burden of proof shifts. What once required certainty now required demonstrating error. The standard was higher. The path forward was narrower. As time passed, the case faded from headlines. The city moved on. The narrative of closure took hold. For many, the story ended with the verdict. The idea that a mistake had been made became uncomfortable to consider. Inside prison walls, the reality was different. Years passed, childhoods ended, opportunities disappeared. The consequences of that night in Central Park became permanent. What remained unresolved was the most fundamental question of all. If the confessions were false, who had committed the crime? That question would linger for years. And eventually, it would return. Years passed after the verdicts. The case faded from public attention, but it never disappeared completely. Legal appeals moved slowly through the courts, raising the same questions that had been dismissed before. The confessions were challenged again and again. The lack of physical evidence remained central, yet nothing changed. Inside prison, the 5 men aged into adulthood. Time marked them differently. Some withdrew into silence. Others clung to the hope that the truth would eventually surface. Outside, their families continued to insist on their innocence, even as public interest waned. Advances in forensic science were reshaping criminal investigations across the country. DNA testing, once limited, became more precise and widely accepted. Old cases were reopened. Evidence that had once been considered inconclusive was re-examined with new methods. In the Central Park case, biological evidence had been preserved. At the time of the trial, it had excluded the defendants. But exclusion alone had not been enough. Years later, that same evidence was tested again, this time against expanded databases. The results were definitive. The DNA did not belong to any of the 5 convicted men. Instead, it matched a known offender who was already serving a sentence for another violent crime. The match was exact. There was no ambiguity. Investigators revisited the original files. The timeline suddenly made sense in ways it never had before. The injuries aligned with a single attacker. The inconsistencies in the confessions were no longer puzzles to be solved, but signs that something had gone wrong from the beginning. The man identified by the DNA had a history that fit the evidence. He had been in the area that night. He had committed similar crimes. And he later confessed, providing details that had never been made public. The confession was not obtained through hours of interrogation. It was straightforward. It matched the forensic record. And it raised a question that could no longer be ignored. If the DNA was correct, then the convictions were wrong. Prosecutors faced a difficult reality. The evidence they had relied upon years earlier had been overturned by science. The confessions, once treated as unshakable, were now clearly unreliable. The system was forced to confront its own conclusions. Public attention returned to the case. Media coverage shifted tone. What had once been framed as a solved crime was now described as a miscarriage of justice. The narrative changed, but the damage remained. For the 5 men, the news arrived slowly. Some heard it through attorneys, others through family visits. The possibility of freedom, once distant, became real for the first time in years. But acknowledgement of error does not move as quickly as truth. Once the DNA results were confirmed, the legal process moved cautiously. Courts do not reverse convictions quickly, even when new evidence is overwhelming. Motions were filed. Hearings were scheduled. Prosecutors reviewed their own records, now forced to reconcile past certainty with present facts. During these proceedings, attention returned to the original investigation. Experts testified about interrogation practices. Psychologists explained how false confessions occur, especially among minors subjected to prolonged questioning. What had once been dismissed as speculation was now supported by decades of research. The confession given by the man identified through DNA was examined in detail. Unlike the earlier statements, it contained specifics that aligned precisely with the crime scene. The timeline matched, the injuries matched, the forensic evidence matched. There was no need to adjust the facts to make the story work. In court, prosecutors acknowledged what had become impossible to deny. The DNA evidence excluded the 5 men entirely. The confessions that formed the basis of the convictions were unreliable. The case against them could not stand. The convictions were vacated. One by one, the men walked out of prison. Some had spent more than a decade incarcerated. Others had lost their teenage years and early adulthood behind bars. Freedom came quietly, without celebration. The moment was real, but it could not restore what had been taken. Public reaction was mixed. Some expressed outrage at the injustice. Others struggled to accept that the system had failed so completely. Questions emerged about accountability. How could this have happened? Who was responsible? And why had it taken so long? Civil lawsuits followed. The city eventually agreed to a settlement, acknowledging the harm caused. Financial compensation was awarded, but it came with an unspoken understanding. Money could not undo years of confinement, lost opportunities, or the psychological toll of wrongful conviction. The case became a reference point in legal education. It was cited in discussions about police interrogation, prosecutorial responsibility, and the limits of confessions as evidence. Reforms were proposed. Some were implemented. Others remained debated. For the men at the center of the case, life after release was complex. Rebuilding required more than freedom. It required identity, trust, and time. Each carried the weight of a story they had never chosen to tell. The truth, when it finally emerged, did not arrive with closure. It arrived with consequences. For individuals, for institutions, for a system forced to confront its own fallibility. What the DNA revealed was not just the identity of the real attacker. It revealed how easily certainty can be manufactured, and how difficult it can be to undo. The case had changed, but its impact remained. And one final question lingered. If science had not intervened, how many others would still be waiting for the truth? Freedom did not arrive the way many had imagined. There were no crowds waiting outside the prison gates, no sense of victory, just silence, paperwork, and the sudden realization that the world had moved on without them. The men stepped into a society they barely recognized. Technology had changed. Neighborhoods had changed. People they once knew had built lives in their absence. Years that should have been formative had been spent behind walls that do not prepare anyone for what comes next. Psychologists who later studied the case described a phenomenon common among the wrongfully convicted. The loss of identity, the difficulty trusting institutions, the lingering fear that freedom could be taken away again. Exoneration does not erase trauma. It simply removes the bars. Each man carried his experience differently. Some spoke publicly. Others chose silence. Interviews revealed how deeply the years of confinement had shaped them. Decisions were harder. Relationships were fragile. Time could not simply be resumed where it had stopped. The legal system acknowledged its mistake, but acknowledgement came late. Official statements emphasized procedural failures rather than personal responsibility. No single individual was held accountable for the years lost. The error belonged to the system, and therefore to no one. Financial compensation followed. Headlines focused on the amount. But money functions poorly as a measure of justice. It cannot restore youth. It cannot repair families strained by absence. It cannot remove the weight of being labeled guilty for most of one's life. Public reaction evolved slowly. At first, disbelief dominated. Then anger. Then resignation. Many preferred to view the case as an exception rather than a warning. Accepting it as a systemic failure would require uncomfortable questions about other convictions built on similar foundations. In law schools and police academies, the case became a lesson. It was cited in discussions about interrogation practices, confirmation bias, and the reliability of confessions. Reforms were proposed. Some departments changed procedures. Others resisted. The story did not end with release. It continued in the form of ongoing debates. How many confessions are false? How often does pressure override truth? How many cases lack the scientific evidence needed to correct them? Behind every statistic is a human cost. Years spent waiting. Families growing older without their children. Parents dying before seeing justice. These are consequences that do not appear in court records. The case forced a reconsideration of a deeply held belief that the system, while imperfect, ultimately corrects itself. In reality, correction often requires chance, a preserved sample, a technological advance, a coincidence. Without DNA, the story would have ended very differently. In the years that followed, the case continued to echo far beyond the courtroom. It appeared in documentaries, books, and academic studies. Not because it was unique, but because it was revealing. It exposed how easily a system designed to protect the public can fail the individuals within it. Experts analyzing the case identified familiar patterns. Confirmation bias. Tunnel vision. The pressure to solve high-profile crimes quickly. Each factor alone might be manageable. Together, they form a structure where mistakes can become permanent. The most uncomfortable truth was also the simplest. No one involved believed they were doing something wrong at the time. Investigators believed they were protecting the city. Prosecutors believed they were presenting justice. Jurors believed they were making a reasonable decision based on what they were shown. That belief is what made the outcome possible. The men at the center of the case were often asked the same question after their release. Do you forgive the system? Their answers varied. Some said forgiveness was necessary to move forward. Others said understanding mattered more than forgiveness. None claimed that accountability had truly been achieved. What remained unresolved was not the crime itself, but its implications. If 5 teenagers could lose years of their lives based on unreliable confessions, how many similar cases existed without the benefit of preserved evidence or advancing technology? Studies later showed that false confessions play a role in a significant number of wrongful convictions. The risk is highest among juveniles. The very people least equipped to navigate interrogation rooms are often the most vulnerable inside them. The case prompted reforms in some jurisdictions. Mandatory recording of interrogations. Limits on questioning minors. Greater scrutiny of confession-based prosecutions. These changes were meaningful but uneven. Implementation depended on geography, policy, and political will. For the men, life moved forward cautiously. Some rebuilt careers, some struggled privately. Public recognition did not always translate into personal peace. Being known for an injustice does not replace what was taken. The story, when viewed in full, does not offer a satisfying resolution. There is no moment where everything balances out. The truth arrives, but it arrives late. Justice is corrected, but not restored. Perhaps that is the most important lesson. The system did not fail because it was broken. It failed because it worked as designed, under pressure, without sufficient safeguards. The night in Central Park was only the beginning. What followed revealed how fragile certainty can be and how long its consequences can last. And as long as decisions are made without questioning how certainty is created, The cost will continue to be paid by those least able to afford it.